It was an ordinary day at the bustling airport. The ambient noise of passengers, the soft announcement of flights, and the aroma of coffee wafting through the air. Yet no one paid attention to Eleanor Washington, a quiet, elderly black woman, as she made her way to her seat, until security rushed over. "Ma'am, we need to remove you from here," the guard said coldly. Eleanor remained calm and composed, firmly holding a first-class ticket. However, just minutes after settling into her seat, a flight attendant approached her and bluntly stated 5 words. She didn't belong there. Without thinking or asking questions, he ordered her to move to the back of the plane. What he failed to realize was that the woman he had just humiliated still wore a radiant smile. Passengers stared wide-eyed, whispers of disbelief spreading everywhere. Little did they know that Eleanor was far from a frail old lady. She was about to change everything. One phone call would bring an airline empire crashing down. It was an ordinary day at JFK Airport. The bustling sounds of passengers, the steady roll of wheeled luggage, and the whispers of flight attendants making final announcements. The sky was overcast, a gray blanket hanging over the city as passengers moved toward their gates. Among the crowd was one who seemed out of place, a quiet elderly woman with the weathered face of someone who had weathered countless storms. Her name was Eleanor Washington, and she was headed to Los Angeles. But what no one could see at that moment was that Eleanor was no ordinary passenger. The young white flight attendant, James, glanced at Eleanor as she made her way toward her first-class seat. His eyes quickly swept over her, taking in the wrinkled brown coat, slightly stooped walk, and the worn leather briefcase she carried. He frowned. "That seat is reserved," he muttered to himself, but Eleanor, with her calm and steady gait, didn't notice. She continued down the aisle, her shoes making soft clicking sounds on the polished floor. She was so determined, each step calculated, her gaze fixed straight ahead as if she had no doubt whatsoever. Within minutes, whispers began circulating among the passengers seated in first class. Several stared at Eleanor as she settled into the plush seat. One of them, a businessman in an expensive suit, raised his eyebrows, looking down his nose at Eleanor. "She must have bought the ticket as a joke," he whispered to the woman beside him, both snickering quietly. Eleanor sat unbothered, eyes closed as she exhaled a sigh of relief. The flight was about to begin, but the whispers didn't stop. James, the flight attendant, returned, now speaking quietly with a security guard standing near the gate. "The woman in seat 1A. She shouldn't be there," he said, his voice just above a whisper. The guard frowned and began moving toward the front cabin, his boots echoing like a warning as he passed through the rows. Eleanor had just opened her eyes when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She looked up to see the guard standing there, his expression severe. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat," the guard said, his voice cold and impersonal. Eleanor blinked slowly, surprised by the interruption. "This is my seat," she replied calmly, holding up her ticket. The guard glanced at the ticket, then back at Eleanor. "Please come with me," he said curtly. Confused, Eleanor stood up, her joints creaking with age. The surrounding passengers watched in silence, some exchanging glances, others looking down at their phones, unaware of what was about to unfold. Eleanor followed the guard down the aisle, her face composed, but her mind racing. Why was this happening? She had done nothing wrong. When they reached the door, the guard turned to her. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave the aircraft." Those words hit Eleanor like a punch. "Leave," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "But I was in my seat." The guard remained unmoved. "Please, ma'am, we're following protocol." And just like that, Eleanor was escorted off the plane. The whispers of passengers grew louder as the door closed behind her. The cold, unforgiving steel of the airport gate seemed to mock her. Her heart raced, but she stood tall, her face betraying nothing. No one understood who she was. No one understood the power she held in her hands. Outside, standing on the tarmac, Eleanor took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. She had a call to make. Just one. The moment her finger dialed the number, everything was about to change. What no one knew was that Eleanor Washington wasn't just an old lady who had been unfairly thrown off a plane. She was the person who would bring this airline to the brink of collapse. With a single call, She would take everything from them, and the story of her quiet revenge would shake the entire aviation industry. But no one, not even Eleanor, could predict how it would all unfold. Eleanor's finger trembled as she dialed. The line connected for a moment, then the voice from the other end came through clearly, calm and confident. "Ms. Washington, how may I assist you today?" It was Robert Gray, CEO of one of the largest investment firms in the world, Eleanor's company, the company that Eleanor owned. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The chaos at the airport, the laughter, the whispers, the coldness of being humiliated seemed distant, as if they had never happened. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Robert, I need you to do something for me. Something big," Eleanor said, her words calm, but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a subtle shift in the air. Robert's voice became more attentive. "Anything you need, Ms. Washington? What is it?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. The face of the security guard, the contemptuous look of the man who had forced her off the plane etched into her memory. The humiliation was unbearable. But now Eleanor's mind was sharper than ever. She had seen so many moments like this in her lifetime. People underestimating her. People thinking they could push her aside. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. "Pull all our funding from that airline," Eleanor said, her voice even. $4 billion, down to the last cent. Another pause, but this time it was filled with disbelief. "Ms. Washington, are you sure? That's an enormous amount. Do you really want to—" "I said pull it now." Robert didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am. I'll handle it immediately." Eleanor could hear the wheels turning in Robert's head, his mind racing as he processed the significance of the request. But it was done. The call was over, the decision made, and the chain of events set in motion. Eleanor stood still for a moment, letting the weight of her actions sink in. She had been thrown off a plane. She had been humiliated. But in that moment, Eleanor Washington knew what no one else could understand. The airline had just made a fatal mistake that would cost them everything. As the noise of the tarmac echoed in her ears, Eleanor walked away from the airport gate. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She could feel the stares of others on her, but she didn't care. She had made the call. Now the real work was about to begin. Back at the airline headquarters, chaos had begun. Robert had acted quickly, calling the entire financial team, directing them to pull every cent from the airline. The pressure was enormous, but Robert wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. As the news spread through the company, executives scrambled to understand why they were losing billions of dollars in real time. Panic began, but it was too late to reverse anything. Eleanor had won. It wouldn't be long before the world found out. The CEO who had laughed at an old lady, the security guard who had been too quick to humiliate her, would all soon realize the grave mistake they had made. The airline, once one of the giants of the industry, was now on the brink of financial bankruptcy, and Eleanor Washington had orchestrated it all with a single call. As she left the airport, Eleanor's mind shifted to the next step. This was just the beginning. The airline would soon know that the price of arrogance was far greater than they could have imagined. As Eleanor made her way to her car, the cold evening air biting into her skin, she felt a strange sense of calm. No hurry, no need to rush. The damage was done. $4 billion rapidly pulled from the airline would send ripples through their entire operation. But Eleanor's plan was far from complete. This was just the first step in a much larger game. She knew that once the news broke, it would only be a matter of time before the world's media descended on the airline. They would demand answers. The executives would scramble, desperately trying to put out the fire of financial bankruptcy that Eleanor had ignited. But it wasn't just the airline she wanted to hurt. It was the arrogance that flowed through its veins, the belief that they could treat humans as nothing more than pawns in their game. Eleanor had once been a pawn. She remembered the days when she had to struggle to make a living, when she was looked down upon by the very people who now thought they could crush her. They had underestimated her then, just as they had today, and now she would make them pay. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She took it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Robert. "The funds have been pulled. The media is asking questions. I've informed the board, and they're in an emergency meeting right now." Eleanor smiled to herself. Things were moving faster than she had anticipated. The tension was building, the pressure mounting. The airline's leadership wouldn't know how to recover from this. They would be scrambling, pointing fingers at each other, wondering who was responsible for such a catastrophic failure. And through it all, Eleanor would remain in the shadows, watching them tear each other apart. But Eleanor had another plan, a final devastating move that would leave them with nothing. She needed to ensure that no one forgot the lesson being taught here. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect. It was about power. As Eleanor turned onto the main highway, her thoughts shifted to the airline's CEO, the man who had ordered her off the plane, the man who had laughed, thinking Eleanor was just another passenger, just another face in the crowd, the man who didn't know he had just crossed paths with the wrong person. Eleanor had done her homework. She knew everything about the CEO, his family, his investments, his weaknesses, and Eleanor had plans to exploit them all. She would be the one to decide when the CEO's empire would crumble. The airline's downfall would be nothing compared to the destruction Eleanor would rain down on him personally. The CEO had made a fatal mistake that day. He had treated Eleanor Washington as if she were disposable. And now Eleanor was about to ensure that the world knew exactly who she was. She would change everything, not just for the airline, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or humiliated. As Eleanor arrived home, she paused for a moment, staring at the front door. There was no going back now. The game had begun. The pieces were moving, and soon the world would see the full capability of Eleanor Washington. As the morning sunlight slowly rose, casting a pale glow over the city, Eleanor sat in her study, staring at the phone in her hand. The world seemed to have changed overnight. The call she had made, the call that would change everything, had begun to echo throughout the industry. The airline's stocks had plummeted. Rumors were spreading like wildfire. And now it was only a matter of time before the world discovered who was behind the storm. The phone vibrated again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a call from Robert. She answered quickly, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "Eleanor." Robert's voice came through on the other end. "The media is tracking this. They're asking questions. The CEO is in full damage control mode. They're scrambling, but this is bad. They don't know what hit them." Eleanor smiled, her fingers lightly tapping on the desk. "Good," she replied calmly. "Let them panic. Let them feel the weight of their mistake." Robert paused for a moment, the silence heavy. "Eleanor, you understand what you've done, don't you? This is bigger than just money. You've got the entire industry watching. They'll retaliate. You need to be ready." "I've been ready for years, Robert. This was never just about the money." Eleanor's voice was steady, unwavering. "This is about something much larger. It's about sending a message." The line grew quiet again. The weight of Eleanor's words was sinking in. Robert knew what Eleanor meant. It was never just about financial gain. It was about breaking the system, showing the world that power didn't just belong to the wealthy and the untouchable. Eleanor had once been humiliated, but now she was the one pulling the strings. "You have a plan, don't you?" Robert asked, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. "I do," Eleanor replied. "And it's about to unfold. The airline's CEO, he's the target. But this will go deeper. I want him to feel the weight of every person who has ever been overlooked, disrespected, or crushed by people like him. The world will know that they are not untouchable." Just as Eleanor finished speaking, her phone vibrated again. She glanced down to see an alert from a news outlet. "Breaking news. Airline CEO faces criticism as $4 billion investment is withdrawn." Eleanor's plan was working. The first wave of public scrutiny had begun, and it would only get worse from here. But this was just the beginning. She wasn't just going to make the CEO sweat. Eleanor's mind was calculating the next move. A business tycoon like him had enemies, and Eleanor knew exactly how to exploit those relationships. She had learned long ago that power wasn't about having money. It was about understanding who held the strings and how to pull them. "I need to make a call," Eleanor said to Robert, her voice suddenly businesslike. "Get me everything on the CEO's personal life, every weakness, every secret. I want to know it all." Robert hesitated, but only for a second. "You'll have it. I'll send it as soon as I can." Eleanor hung up, her mind racing with possibilities. The media frenzy was just a small piece of what was to come. Now that the airline's leadership was under pressure, it was time to make the final move. Eleanor would ensure that the CEO never forgot the day he made the mistake of crossing paths with Eleanor Washington. As the day progressed, Eleanor began putting her plan into action. She was patient, meticulous. Every piece was falling into place, and once complete, there would be no turning back. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Eleanor stood by the window of her penthouse, looking out at the vast city below. The city lights twinkled like stars, but her mind was focused elsewhere. Her plan was coming to fruition, and there was no turning back. Every move she made was calculated, every person she spoke to carefully chosen. She had reshaped the world in her image. But now, with the final piece of the puzzle falling into place, she was about to bring everything to its ultimate conclusion. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Robert. "They're in full panic mode. Reports say the CEO is being questioned by law enforcement. The media is demanding answers. It's only a matter of time before they realize what they've lost." Eleanor smiled, her fingers curling around the edge of her whiskey glass. The clink of ice was the only sound breaking the silence. "Good," she whispered. "Let them panic. Let them feel the consequences of their actions." But Eleanor knew that it wasn't enough to just destroy the airline's reputation. She had to make the CEO pay. She had to make him feel the pain of every person who had ever been mistreated by the elite. Eleanor's plan was never just about a simple financial deal. It was about sending a message to the entire industry. To those who thought they could play God with other people's lives. To those who thought their wealth and influence would shield them from the consequences of their arrogance. A sudden knock at the door pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. She set down her glass and moved toward the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a young man dressed immaculately in a tailored suit. The man stepped in, handing Eleanor a sealed envelope. "Everything is ready, Ms. Washington," the man said with a nod. "All is in place." Eleanor took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. This was it, the final step. She opened it carefully, reading the contents. Inside was a legal document, one that would change everything. It was a demand for the full return of the $4 billion investment, plus interest within 48 hours. If not, the document threatened to expose the CEO's darkest secrets, secrets that would destroy his career and life. Eleanor had what she needed. Now it was time to make the call that would end it all. She dialed the number, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Ms. Washington," the voice on the other end answered, slightly trembling. I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "I have what I need," Eleanor said calmly, her voice cool and collected. "But if you want to avoid the consequences, you will comply with my demands. I suggest you start thinking about damage control. You have 48 hours. Don't make me wait any longer." There was a long pause on the other end, the tension palpable. Then the CEO spoke again, his voice shaking. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Eleanor. You've made a grave mistake." Eleanor's lips curved into a smile. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and you're about to find out how wrong you were to cross me." The line went dead. Eleanor set the phone down, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. The CEO had no idea what was coming. Eleanor had played her cards perfectly, and now the final act was unfolding. As she sat back in her chair, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The world would soon know what it meant to underestimate Eleanor Washington. This was no longer about money or power. It was about legacy. Eleanor was about to ensure that her name would be the last one anyone ever forgot.